The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local journalism today at chly.ca/donate. Local news doesn't survive without local support.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. Gabriola Island trustee Toby Elliott says concern over the concept of a shoreline buffer zone led more residents to turn out to a recent meeting than the venue could fit. Elliott wrote about tensions present at that meeting in a post on her Substack, attributing them in part to apprehensions around the potential impact of last year's BC Supreme Court decision around Cowichan title to certain land in Richmond. I spoke with Trustee Elliott about the situation. What happened at a recent local trust committee meeting that prompted you to share on Substack a piece that delved into some tensions you were seeing in the room?
Yeah, so January 22nd was our regular local trust committee meeting in which we come together, 3 trustees, the 2 locally elected trustees and a chair to discuss business. And there was a larger than usual group of residents who attended. And many seemed to be coming out of concern over a proposal that had come forward in conversation at a community meeting in September related to shoreline buffer protections in the context of our official community plan review. And so there was just a very large turnout. There was also lots of people there representing, I think, sort of reconciliation support or support for reconciliation policies in the policy statement, which was another piece of work that we were there to discuss. The LTC was giving its referral response to Trust Council on a very large policy document that we've been working on for, I think it's going on 8 or 9 years now. So these 2 issues, the OCP review, and in the context of that, a shoreline buffer zone that had been proposed for further conversation with the community, and the policy statement was raising alarm.
What is the situation with the shoreline buffer zone? Where is that at, and what is that?
So in directing our planners to how are we going to develop policies to protect the environment, to ensure that Indigenous interests and concerns with the protection of cultural heritage, which is their property, is included in our OCP, we give them pretty open space to have discussions as needed and come back to the LTC with information and the further direction. So in their discussions with various First Nations, including Snuneymuxw First Nation and Comox up in the north, which our planners are also working on housing policies, for example, on Denman Island, there was raised this concern that the shoreline area is a very special, sensitive area that has a lot of environmental and cultural considerations that we should really pay special attention to. Now, almost everybody knows this. You can see it in the settlement patterns on the islands. There's a lot of lots concentrated along the waterfront because, of course, that's an area where everybody wants to live. And so there's an extra concentration of residential development. But this isn't just recent. Indigenous people have been, clustering and building villages and their clam beds, and all the rich cultural heritage in the Gulf Islands is really concentrated on the shores. It has been for thousands and thousands of years. So we've got these layers of considerations that we really need to pay special attention to. And so it was a heads up. We're going to have to look at how do we protect all the different assets, so the built environment included, as well as the cultural elements that First Nations have a right to have a say into how that's protected, as well as the ecological and environmental considerations in this large area. And so we framed it as this is a conversation. There's going to need to be eventually policy and regulations developed. We're not there yet, but what happened is residents sort of not understanding that this was still a very initial, early phase of conversation, mistook this as regulation and thought that decisions had already been made about, policies were in place, regulations and land use bylaws had been changed, and their property rights had been impacted in some way. And this was all done out of sight of the residents and property owners who were affected. So this was what had caused a lot of alarm, was a sort of misunderstanding of where we are in the process. It was meant to be a heads up, this is coming, we need to have conversations about that. But no policies had been developed yet, no regulations, nothing is in place. And so there was really nothing to consult stakeholders about, because that's all still to come.
When it comes to the tensions that you were writing about at the recent local trust committee meeting, how do you think, if at all, the decision last year over Cowichan title, how do you think that is kind of hanging over all of this?
Yeah. So I do have to be careful and frame any discussion relating to the Cowichan tribe's decision in August of 2025 as it's really beyond my purview as a local government official, because it's very much a provincial and a Richmond specific matter, and with the Cowichan tribes. But what it has done is create a lot of uncertainty for landholders everywhere. And questions come up such as, well, what if a nation declares Aboriginal title, and how are my land rights affected? So we are having to have these conversations about landholder rights, title and rights holder rights, and what does that potentially mean when we can't answer those questions specifically in this context right now. It's a lot of what ifs. And so what seems to be happening is people, some of them are even going, I think, to ChatGPT or AI to ask these questions. Are my rights affected on Gabriola Island because of the Cowichan tribe's decision? And then they get sort of an answer that's based on whatever the internet is collating, and then they come to us with those concerns, and we can't really say, well, nothing is affected, because there is no change in land use right now. There is no intention to or plans to expropriate or change land use or title. So it's creating a lot of confusion, and it's sort of layering on a lot of anxiety about any discussions with the protection of Indigenous cultural heritage. So I think the thing that we need to really understand from the Cowichan tribe's decision, and what I'm learning as a locally elected leader, is that when decisions are made outside of the public view and people aren't consulted, it creates this vacuum of uncertainty and fear, and that there's a reaction on the other side of that. So I think real consultation with our community looks like bringing all the options back to them and saying, here's what this will look like, here's the potential impacts for your property, and then what do you think? But what was expressed at that meeting, and what was sort of really gave rise to my post about the tensions and sort of potential for it's hard to frame, because it was pointed out in the meeting, and I really encourage people to go and listen to that January 22nd meeting to understand the conversation more fully. But there were several people who are Indigenous who were there, and they pointed out, at least one elder pointed out, that when we talk about private property rights as the only right that needs to be considered in decision making, whether it's for whatever reason, because you're a taxpayer, because you hold title to a piece of property, that really seems to imply that other rights don't matter. And there was some language expressed by folks in the meeting who are concerned about, are their rights going to be impacted, that they don't want to see protection for cultural heritage. Now, the challenge is that cultural heritage is not ours. It is not yours to decide how that is protected. A First Nation has the right to say, here's what we need to see in the protection of our cultural property. It is property. And so we haven't been able to have that conversation in a really good way. As I said, staff with this Nanaimuk First Nation staff are in early conversation about how to bring that forward. What will the criteria potentially look like? But landowners are going to be consulted on that because, of course, it is their property and we all need to be included in that conversation. I do think we need to have a conversation about what does ownership mean? Ownership is a form of tenure on the land, and there are many forms of tenure on a piece of land. I gave some instance in my posts about the Crown, federal government owns subsurface rights to minerals that exists on under private property. A First Nation has the right to their cultural property, and that might be locked up on somebody's private property. There's multiple layers of jurisdiction that we have to consider, especially in the water zones and in the foreshore area. So a local government, provincial, and the federal government all have different responsibilities of how they regulate activities and development on the land and water. So we have to respect all of these rights when we are considering future development. But the fact is that the protection of Indigenous cultural property is already enshrined in law, and we need to respect that in our official community plan.
Toby Elliott is trustee for Gabriola Island with the Islands Trust.
Midcoast Morning is part of our nonprofit newsroom project, supported by listeners like you. Keep this program on the air by funding it today with a monthly sustaining donation at chly.ca/donate. We've got tote bags and shirts if you need an incentive.
Plans to update British Columbia's Heritage Conservation Act have been delayed. The Act exists for the protection and conservation of sites with historical, cultural, and archaeological value in the province. Major changes haven't been made to it since 1996. The government has been in the midst of reviewing the Act for a number of years. It lists making permitting faster and easier, helping people and communities rebuild more quickly after disasters such as wildfires and floods, and strengthening the role of First Nations in decision-making about their own heritage and ancestors as being among the desired outcomes of an updated Act. Amendments had been expected this spring, but earlier this month the government announced a delay, saying the extra time is to gather and incorporate additional feedback from industry, local governments, and First Nations. I spoke with Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council President Judith Sayers about the situation.
Aklama, Tois, Hubachasaksut Nuu-chah-nulth. My English name is Judith Sayers, and I am president of the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council. But in relation to the Heritage Conservation Act, I am the co-chair of the Joint Working Group on First Nations Heritage Conservation Act. I was appointed by the Leadership Council to this position.
Now, when it became apparent, when the news broke that the legislation to update the act had been delayed, what was your reaction?
Well, we've known for some time that the legislation couldn't go through in the spring. So it wasn't a surprise to me. When the UBCM decided or lobbied to have more time for consultation and the minister gave it to them, it threw our whole timeline out of whack. And so we knew we couldn't get it through the spring with that delay. But we are targeting the fall legislation. There's no secret about that. So it is, 4 or 6 months that we're going to have to wait. But it gave everybody the opportunity to weigh in, because the consultations were extended to November the 15th. And then we will be coming back with what we call a 3-column document, which would be proposing legislation, what the legislation would look like. And that is done under non-disclosure agreements. And so people will have a chance to weigh in on that as well.
So among the reasons for updating this act that the government has talked about are making a permitting process faster and easier, and also protecting heritage more effectively. What do you think it's important for people to know about the state of the Heritage Conservation Act now, and what you feel needs to be updated?
Okay. So the Heritage Conservation Act is 20 years old. And 20 years ago, First Nations were not involved in the drafting of the legislation. And so a lot of our values and needs were not taken into consideration. And the Act continues to have a lot of issues. That's why you see it on the front page. Well, it's not really newspapers anymore, but you see high stories about this, because there aren't really any good mechanisms for conserving First Nations heritage. There are issues in the permitting process because consultations aren't being done properly, or they're taken into consideration too late. So the new act will also expand the definition of heritage to include heritage that isn't necessarily necessarily does not have physical evidence, such as our sacred sites. I don't know if you remembered the Songhees and Bear Mountain. Bear Mountain, is that right? Anyway, their sacred site was destroyed because there was no physical evidence. They used that as a sacred place. They left no footprints. They left nothing there. But the archaeologist says, "Oh, nothing's here," and it was destroyed. Instead of the Songhees had chosen not to talk about that site, to try and keep it secret. And so we want to take into account better ways of working, not only with First Nations but everybody. How do we preserve the heritage in British Columbia in a better way? How can we improve the permitting process? There's great fears out there about the cost of, doing an archaeological survey in your backyard when you're going to build a house or those sorts of things. And so these are some of the things that we want to talk about. Some of the compliance and enforcement issues are huge, and they need to be addressed and looked at. So, this process of amending the Heritage Conservation Act has been taking place over 4 years. This was the third round of engagements that we've had with local governments, with industry, third parties, First Nations. Every time we've done, and I'm on the working group that is doing this. So, although it's BC's legislation, I'm still a part of the working group. And every time we gather information from people, we make changes, input. And so we're just compiling now all of the engagements that we've had. And then we'll move forward to the next step, what we call, like I was saying, the 3-column document, which is proposing what the legislative amendments will be. So that's kind of where we are. We just really, really, really need to update this legislation and to ensure that it's in compliance with the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which means that First Nations should have decision-making, and those will be negotiated agreements with the province. So it's not something that is just a veto or, all those things that people get scared about. It's not. It's just about, can we make this process better, quicker, and involve First Nations clearly from the very beginning?
You alluded earlier on to the fact that the UBCM had raised some concerns around some of the proposed amendments. Some of the things that they talked about in their writings, they suggested that there's the potential scope creep of a proposed expanded definition of heritage to include specific intangible cultural values. They wrote about the need for the ability of local governments to choose among archaeological firms, they express concern that some of the changes might have the opposite impact of expediting the permitting process and might slow development. What's kind of your response overall, or to some of the specific concerns that the UBCM have raised?
Well, first of all, they were complaining that they didn't have much engagement, which, like I said, they've been involved for 4 years, and they have been, and they've been involved in this. There, some of this heritage that they're talking about, and I think we were talking about non-tangible heritage. It's always been taken into consideration. So my nation once refused to have a woodlot in a certain area because there was a sacred site there. Ministry of Forests sent in a person to investigate it, decided there was a sacred site there, even though there was no physical evidence, and the woodlot didn't go ahead in that area. And, like if Bear Mountain, like I mentioned earlier, if they had told them about that and said, then it would have been up to BC to say, okay, well, we're going to preserve that. It's a sacred site. So, this is like parks, heritage in parks. And, you can't really see it but it's there. And so that's what we want to preserve. That's why we want to expand the definition of heritage, because it's already there. It's already included, but it's just not specifically spelled out. And so we're just trying to find a way to make it more inclusive so all the heritage of everybody is taken into account.
How, if at all, do you feel the reverberations or the discourse or the kind of cascading political impacts of last year's court decision around Cowichan title have played into this process with this act and potentially the delay?
I think it has a lot. Because people are afraid that we're just going to take over the land and make our own decisions, do whatever we want to do, and people have misconstrued that court case. Yeah, there's definitely Cowichan title there. And what does that mean? BC and Cowichan need to sit down and to work on that. What is the compensation? How are we going to do that? People have to understand in the right way. What do these decisions actually mean? Not just, believe anything that people are saying out there. And there's a lot of scare tactics, a lot of fear mongering, but that's not what this is about. And so, unfortunately, I think a lot of what happened with UBCM was from that court case, and in the mining case, the interpretation of UNDRIP. And so that's what UNDRIP was all about. DRIPA, the provincial law, was for First Nations to work together and improve legislation so that our rights and values could be properly reflected in a law, and to conserve our culture, to have a role in our culture. Because right now we don't really have a defined role in protecting that. And so let's define it. And that's what we're really, we're trying to do here, trying to make things easier, and find tools to do that. Because I remember, if you remember the Musqueam case at the end of Granville, there was a graveyard. And I remember meeting with the deputy minister, assistant deputy minister, going, we don't have any tools. We can't do anything. We want to protect this, but there's nothing we can do. And so they ended up, Musqueam had to come up with the money to buy it. That shouldn't be how things happen. And so we need to find the mechanisms to put into a law so that it can be carried out. These are, real examples, or people will, dig up a gravesite because they know the penalties is something they can do at the cost of business. So we have to change the mindset to think, hey, let's work with the First Nations and preserve what we can and respect, the burial sites or whatever, sacred site, whatever is there, and do better. And so, instead of saying, no, we're not going to do this, or no, we can't do that, let's talk about it. And that's what these sessions have been about. And, we've had industry, just recently at the Natural Resources Forum saying, hey, why is this? People think that this process has been put on hold. That's not true. We're still meeting all the time. We're working on it. We're going to get this legislation to a fall. But industry is worried as well. I mean, you hear some of their worries, but they worry that it's not going to go through because they know it's not working. If something's not working, let's change it. Law is not a good law unless it can be enforced. And so that's just what we're trying to do in this process.
You suggested that you foresee this on the legislative agenda for the fall. Where do you see this going? What do you see the impact of it being?
Well, we have a schedule. Believe me, the BC legislative process is very complex and drawn out, and they have a lot of laws. So we're on a very strict schedule to get things done. And so want to get through that process and then have it in the fall and have a law in place. Hoping that the Premier's desire to amend DRIPA isn't going to impede us in this regard. I just can't predict that. But right now, every change we're making is in compliance with UNDRIP. And this is why we're doing this. We have it well versed. So my hope, my dream, and, I've been, we've been working on the legislative process for over 4 years, but we've been trying to change this. I've been involved since 2006. It's been a really, really long road to hoe. But our hope is that we will get this through. And, there's still some things we didn't get in this legislation that we still have to work on. But right now, let's take what we can get. Let's make some positive changes. People can see that it's working, and then we can do other things later.
Judith Sayers is president of the New Channel Tribal Council and co-chair of the Joint Working Group on the Heritage Conservation Act. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe for updates from our nonprofit newsroom and more. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, you can email us at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
This program gives thanks to the Snuneymuxw First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.